Good morning. Okay, the Zuckerberg initiative was set up to support bold ideas. One of these is, can we cure, prevent, or manage all disease by the end of the century? The Human Cell Atlas is funded to work towards this goal by creating a comprehensive reference map of all human cells as the basis for both understanding human health and diagnosing, monitoring, and treating disease. The project will generate, organize, and standardize petabytes of data for billions of cells at hundreds of labs around the world. We make this open and accessible to the scientific community, helping researchers to innovate without barriers to data access. The Data Coordination Platform is the infrastructure project tasked with supporting the data generated by the HCA. It has over 60 scientists and engineers in teams from 4 organizations: the Broad Institute from Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Zuckerberg Initiative in Palo Alto, EBI in Cambridge, UK, and UCSC in Santa Cruz. Each team works on a different part of the component of the infrastructure: ingest, data store, secondary analysis, and the data portal. Each component has a defined interface so it can be independently worked on. We also make it easy for computational researchers to develop and share new analysis approaches on the Human Cell Atlas as tertiary analysis portals. All the software we develop is in the open and made available as open source. My name is Dan. I lead the development team at EBI working on the ingest component. We take the metadata and data from contributors, either submitted through the user interface or programmatically through the ingest API. We then validate the metadata and data to our standards and transfer this package to the data store. As new data becomes available, the secondary analysis component analyzes data and provides the results back through ingest to the data store. The data portal allows browsing of the data in the data store. In future, third-party portals will provide additional ways of exploring and analyzing the data further. When we set out to build the ingest component, we had several goals in mind. Having built submission systems before, we knew that the last thing a researcher wants is to battle to contribute their data. So we aim to make it as painless as possible. It's also important that the data in HCA is high quality and follows the FAIR principles. This requires a balancing act between minimizing the time for submission and the amount of curation required, while still maintaining high quality. So the infrastructure should enable this through automation. So being a 5-year project in an area where techniques and technologies are rapidly developing, it is difficult to estimate both the volume and the types of data to expect. Therefore, we needed a system that can scale and adopt to whatever is thrown at it. As we work in the open and our software is open source, we also have the added benefit that the software is reusable and extensible by anyone. So today I'll focus on the technology choices we've made so far to support these goals. We decided to keep the metadata standards agile, modular, and flexible. This will allow us both to support current and yet unknown future HCA use cases, but it also allows us to support similar data ingestion scenarios in the future. We define metadata at a high level with projects, biomaterials, protocols that describe process, and files. We then refine these core data types to provide more specific types and features. This gives us a very flexible model for representing the processes used to derive the contributed data. An important architectural goal has been to make the infrastructure itself decoupled from the schema of data passing through it. This gives us the advantage that metadata and infrastructure can evolve independently. We store all metadata in JSON format. JSON's widely used, it's easy to parse with standard tools, And it means we can use the same representation of data throughout the stack, from the UI through the API to the persistence layer. We use the draft JSON schema standard for defining our metadata standards. Even though it's a work in progress rather than an approved standard, it has enabled us to define our modular data model. It's been a powerful tool for validating that the data complies with our metadata standards, and this gives us both the flexibility and familiarity of JSON, but also enables us to have the data consistency that the platform needs. We also use the JSON schema to automatically generate spreadsheets for data input for use by contributors and data wranglers. The data provided in these spreadsheets can then be automatically translated back into valid JSON for submission. The ingest infrastructure itself follows a microservices architecture. This means the system comprises of many small components that we can deploy and scale independently. The core ingest API is written in Java, and then we write the clients like validators and brokers that act on the API in Python, the idea being to make these components accessible and extensible by the bioinformatics community. We publish each service as Docker images to make deployment self-contained and reusable. So if you want to use our metadata validator on your own machine or your own project, you can just download our Docker image and run it. We use Kubernetes to orchestrate the system. So I see Kubernetes as effectively an operating system for the data centers. It allows us to group a set of virtual machines running on cloud infrastructure into a cluster and treat them as if they were one big machine. So Kubernetes takes our desired state for what to run, in our case, instances of our Dockerized services, and makes the best use of the cluster's resources. It's a bit like playing a game of Tetris. Kubernetes is working out how to fit everything together to make as effective use of the resources as possible. If we say want 15 healthy instances of the metadata validator component to be running at all times, Kubernetes ensures that if one instance has an error or the virtual machine goes offline, new instances spin up automatically and requirements are maintained without interruption. This also allows us to be flexible in how we deal with different data sets. If we have a small number of large files, it's not a problem. We can create a few large processes to validate them. But also, if we have a huge number of small files, that's also not a problem because we can just scale multiple processes in parallel. Another huge benefit that Kubernetes gives us is that it abstracts us away from any particular cloud provider, making us cloud agnostic. We can create a Kubernetes cluster on Amazon Web Services, Google Compute Platform, or an on-premises OpenStack infrastructure, for example. Ingest will function in the same way without modification. But Kubernetes is a new and evolving technology. Running it in production has been difficult, as though it provides a simple abstraction, there's a lot going on under the surface. This is why we're now looking towards managed Kubernetes platforms such as the recently released AWS Elastic Kubernetes Service and GCP's Google Kubernetes Engine. So we're now working on an automated script to allow deployment of a specific version of Ingest using Helm, which is a Kubernetes package manager, and Terraform, which is a deployment automation system. When this is complete, we hope to be able to support other projects standing up their own infrastructure. Already, the NeMO, the Neuroscience Multi-Omics archive at IGS, University of Maryland, Baltimore, has already created their own instance of as the data repository for the BRAIN initiative. This is based on DCP infrastructure, and with some help, they could get the system up and running. With the work we're doing to create the push-button installation and more comprehensive documentation, this should get much easier, so watch this space. Remember, this is still a pre-production system, and it will improve as we get more feedback. I'll now hand over to Brian O'Connor, who will tell you a bit more about what happens in the DCP post-ingestion.
Great.
Brian.
Thank you. So Mike is here, right? All right, thanks, Dan. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the DCP platform and the various other components sort of downstream of ingest. Taking a step back, though, as a scientist coming into the DCP, what can it do for you? It provides access to the HCA data in order for researchers to make biological discoveries, to develop and benchmark analysis methods, create tools, new applications on top of the HCA data, facilitate collaboration. But I think for the folks in this room and for myself, I'm also really interested in another thing that the DCP can do, and that is to provide some really useful, key, open source, cloud-based infrastructure components that are actually reusable, across other projects, across other efforts. So I'm going to dive into some of the details about what these DCP components are, how they're designed, what they do. Taking a look at the overall colored boxes diagram, I'm going to focus on green box or the analysis component, blue box or the cloud-based storage component, and orange box or the discovery sort of portals component, which are all kind of downstream and being fed through the ingest system with data. In terms of the storage component, our blue box, aka the HCA Data Store, provides a lot of functionality on top of S3 or Google Bucket Store. And you may be wondering, like, hey, why do you need this thing? You could just stick files in an S3 bucket and do an IAM policy on it, and it's fine. But this system actually provides a lot more functionality on top of the basic cloud storage object stores out there. And one of the nice things is it provides multi-cloud synchronization. So as data flows into Amazon or Google, it's synchronized automatically to other cloud mirrors. One thing that I think is very important for users developing on top of the data store is it provides a consistent API regardless of what cloud environment you're working with. So you can work with these data objects regardless of whether you're on Google or Amazon. It provides indexing and search. So as data flows into the system, if files are marked as metadata and they're marked as JSON, they'll actually automagically, if you will, be indexed in Elasticsearch and allow you to do queries on them. And then it provides the features that you would expect to access data files, things like signed URLs or the ability to access direct URLs if your tool demands that. In terms of how data is organized, it's a little bit different than the standard bucket as well, in the sense that we don't have just random collection of files in a bucket, but we actually bundle them together in a concept called data bundles. And this is actually a pretty core fundamental part of the data store. Data bundles are a collection of files, and the data bundles and the files themselves can be versioned. So over time, we can add new versions of these files and overall increment the data bundle version as well. These files can be data or metadata, and as I said before, metadata is automatically indexed if it's JSON. And the clients interacting with these data bundles can retrieve individual files of the full data bundle and pick specific versions. So this is a very convenient way of organizing information, especially when you're thinking about it in terms of data processing and workflows running and what the output of a workflow, how to group the output of a workflow together. In terms of accessing the blue box or the HCA Data Store, there's really two ways to do it right now. One is, as a developer, we of course provide a RESTful API, as everyone would expect. And this consumer API allows you to access the data bundles and the files via checkout service if you want to work with cloud native URLs or signed URLs, if that's your preference. A second set of API endpoints allow you to do searching and retrieval of the files of the data bundles directly. And a third series of endpoints allow you to actually subscribe to notifications. And this is actually a very cool feature of the blue box in the sense that I can write queries that I register. And over time, as new data comes into the system and matches those queries, I get notifications. So you'll see how we actually utilize that notification system in a couple different ways. So the second way to interact is really in parallel to the API. We have an HCA command line that's pip installable, so easy to get access to. And it really mirrors all the functionality that I told you about from the API perspective, but it's super convenient if you're going to script on top of the HCA command line. You want something that you can easily script on top of. Okay, so that gave you a flavor of what the data store or blue box component looks like and how it works. The analysis component is the next piece of the puzzle. And this is a system, the green box effectively is a system for automating the analysis of HCA data using best practice pipelines. And right now we have SmartSeq 2 and 10x pipelines, but given the nature of the HCA, we have a lot of imaging data that will come in the future. This is a multi-year project, so experimental designs will evolve and adapt over time. We're expecting quite a few workflows to be onboarded as sort of best practices in order to provide consistently harmonized data throughout the atlas. So the green box is less of a piece of software that you can install, whereas the blue box, you can actually use Terraform scripts to set it up. But the green box is really more about a collection of best practices and technologies that most people in this room, I'm sure, use on a probably daily basis. So that means that the workflows are written to be portable, they're written in WDL, they're registered on DocStore, they're calling out to Docker-based tools, so containerized tools. They're executed in Cromwell as a service on Google Cloud environment. So it's really putting together a lot of technologies that many of the people in this room use pretty regularly. The other thing that I think is really cool coming out of the green box, and I should have mentioned that this is Tim Tickle's group at the Broad that's working on the green box for HCA. One of the things that Tim's group is working on as well is a benchmarking environment. So this is really a place where scientists in the HCA can come in, develop their new workflow, compare it to existing workflows, use benchmark data, but also on the flip side of this is a place where it's teaching HCA scientists how to write portable workflows, how to Dockerize their tools, how to express their workflows in WDL and test them in a cloud environment. So it's really encouraging those best practices. And the goal is to use this as a mechanism to onboard more pipelines in the future to harmonize more and more data types coming into HCA. Okay. And then the third component that I want to talk a little bit about is the discovery component, or the orange box. So the orange box is divided into two parts. One is a portal that provides things like links out to documentation, an overview, a nice little cool diagram where you can see the different tissue types that the HCA atlas contains. And the second part is a data browser that is what you would expect for a sort of modern, faceted data browser to quickly find subsets of the HCA data that you're interested in. So much like the green box, which receives events coming from the blue box when new data is onboarded, in the case of the green box that's doing data analysis, it's running pipelines and workflows depending on what data is coming into the system. We do a very, very similar thing here for the orange box or for the data browser. And so as new data is onboarded in the blue box, the events are fired off, and we have an AWS Lambda indexer that will receive those events, process the metadata, make it into an Elasticsearch friendly form, a faceted browsing friendly form, onboard it into that system, and provide access to the data browser so we can actually explore the data that's available in HCA. So again, event-driven, just like the green box. From an end user's perspective, super convenient. They don't have to write complicated queries and hit an endpoint. They can just use the simple data browser. In this case, I'm zooming in on organ and organ part here to show you what that facet looks like. And once the user is able to facet down to the subset of data that they're interested in, they can use a manifest that they get from the site, either programmatically through our API to retrieve that information, or they can use the HCA command line to actually access those files and do what they need to with them. So that's how the faceted browser works and how it's tied into eventing. What we're working on now over the summer is really adding value to the data browser by not adding functionality to it. And what I mean by that is we don't want this data browser to be the only place that people take HCA data and visualize it on the web. We actually want a whole lot of different portals out there to be available to visualize and to perform analysis on HCA data. So we're working with the community tertiary analysis portal developers to create a handoff mechanism so someone can do a search in the data browser, find the information that they're interested in, and then hand it off to a portal for visualization. For example, one of the groups that we're working with is the UCSC cell browser. to hand off search results and have that be visualized in real time in their single cell data browser, which is super cool. Okay, so how do researchers actually then use this infrastructure? I gave you an idea of like what the components are, but day to day, how are people actually accessing this data, and what can you do right now? If you want to get access to single cell data, where do you go? So I'm very happy to say that over in the spring, we essentially set up a preview. It includes 3 data sets. These range between thousands of cells to hundreds of thousands of cells. And these are available on a preview of our DCP infrastructure. So you can go to this website, you can get instructions on how to access the data. But more importantly, the underlying APIs are available for doing searching. So you can write Elasticsearch queries on top of our API. You can use those either via the command line or via the API. And we also are encouraging folks to use this data not just for download. You can certainly do a download to your local machine, but we're encouraging folks to use this directly in the cloud environments using the manifest from the web GUI, using the API to directly stream your data from the HCA Data Store to Spark or Jupyter or in the future tertiary analysis portals. Okay, and if you want to get your hands dirty, the best place to do that is to actually take a look at our data consumer vignettes repository, where we're collecting Jupyter notebooks, Spark examples, like real world examples of how you actually use these components to access HCA data and to do your research. So I think that's really a cool repo and pretty neat examples in there. Okay, so the last part of the talk is really about DCP component reuse by other projects. So there was a recent blog post, I think this actually was back in October, by Benedict Payton and other PIs that are on related projects called the Data Biosphere. And you can reach the blog post here at databiosphere.org. I think the key take-home, there's a lot of interesting stuff that was happening in that article, but I think the key take-home was the realization that there are a lot of components that are in common with many, many different projects out there. So as we're writing grants and thinking about how to create infrastructure for a variety of various projects, we realize that almost every project we're on and our collaborators are on need a blue box equivalent. They need a data storage piece. They need a tool repository, a workflow engine, a workspace, an indexing and search browser. And so there's a lot of commonality between projects like Anvil or DataStage or Commons, HCA, NeMO we heard mentioned already by Dan. And so what's happening now, what's really interesting to see is people are looking at the infrastructure we're building for HCA and saying, that data storage piece, that's actually very useful, that fits in with what I need for my project. And we're starting to see these other projects pick up these components as well. I mean, I think there's space in the data biosphere concept for many different implementations. So another thing that we're doing as part of these projects is to also look at what are the API standards, if you will, that can be layered on top of these components. So we can have the HCA Blue Box be used by one project and IndexD, say, used by another project, and still be able to access data in the same way across them. So it's really exciting to see HCA components getting reused in other projects, and also exciting to see interest in building sort of common API bridges between various implementations. Okay, so what's next for the DCP? Well, we had an interesting spring where we were showing the preview release and getting that out the door, and that was really awesome. Over the summer, we're working on continuously sort of releasing and improving our DCP infrastructure and adding additional data sets. And going into the fall, we're wanting to get more and more feedback from the community using these preview data sets, using the DCP infrastructure programmatically, using our software for other projects. We want to use the fall to basically collect that feedback as we work towards our initial data release in the project. So how can you get involved? Please go ahead, try the preview HCA data. If you're interested in single cell data, big thumbs up on that. Go ahead and try it. Try and use our existing infrastructure for our API, our command line utility. Try and use the data. The second thing is to take a look at the HCA organization, which has links out to all of our software components. And finally, feedback would be great at Data Help. We're trying to aggregate feedback to a single email address so we can aggregate it and send it to the right teams within HCA. So with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone. There's so many people involved in the DCP infrastructure. And I can quickly take maybe a question or two. I think I have about a minute to go.
So next speaker is